My name is Kelcey Steele, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. I've recently started freelancing. I was at Primal Screen for about 5 years. So I'm going to play my reel. Thank you. And all of those projects came from my time at Primal Screen. So I'm going to jump into Cinema 4D, and the first thing I'm going to cover is going through customizing layouts and key commands and setting up my default scene to make my life a little bit easier, adding things that I need to use all the time. So this is what you're going to see with a clean install of C4D. And one of the first things I do is I generally don't use that startup menu. So I'm going to go and just start setting up some of my default settings. So I'll hit Command E to bring up my preferences. And because I work in Redshift, I'll also bring up my render settings by hitting Command B. I was in the search field. All right, so I'm going to start with just changing everything to Redshift, and that's going to allow me to bring up my contextual Redshift settings. I'll also do a couple of different adjustments here. I'm going to change this to 1920 by 1080. I'll come into my preferences now and come down to renderer. I'll go into Redshift, and I want to see that in the main menu, so I'll check that on, and that'll print it up here in the main menu. I'm also going to make a couple of other changes. I like to put my paste objects at previous, and then if I have anything selected over here in the objects menu, it's just going to put it above what I had selected. So then I'm going to go into a couple of other things. I like to use the object mode for my camera. I'll come over to Redshift, and I'm going to let's see. I'm going to unselect node materials for presets. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over and make a new Redshift material. And because I had that unchecked, when I double click on the material, it's going to bring up the Espresso style editor. So then I'll come back into my render settings, go back into Redshift, and I'll check that again. And I'm going to create a Redshift standard material. So now when I double click on this material, it's going to bring up the node editor. And I like to save these into my default scene so that I have something to start with. It's a good way to have materials to start with. And if I'm using Grayscale Gorilla materials, which I do a lot because it's a great resource, those open in the Espresso style editor. So it's great to have both of those available so that I can just pull and copy from either of those materials. And in newer versions, they have added these pop-outs, but I generally, on an older version, I usually like to just bring up an asset browser and an attribute manager and just dock those on either side. And that lets me work really easily, and I can see everything also by just hitting H, and that'll zoom everything into the view in the node editor. And then I will go into memory and up my undo depth a little bit. And then I can just keep customizing from here. And as I'm working, I'm going to come up to Window, and I'm going to go to Customization and save this as my default scene. So now every time I open Redshift or open Cinema 4D, it's going to open with my Redshift settings and with these two materials already in the scene. So then I'll get my scene basic set up. I usually start by doing a really simple 3-point lighting setup. So go to Redshift, and I'm going to add a light. Do this as an area light. I'm going to right click and give that an animation tag. Give it a target. I'll create a null. So we'll just go ahead and target that light to the null. So now if I grab my light, I can pull this away, and it's always going to point towards the center of the scene. And I can hold Command and drag another light over and just kind of put these 3 lights just in the scene. I've taken a lot more time in my own default scene, but it's great to have those as a starting point. I'm also going to add a Redshift dome light. I'll bring up my asset browser, and I can type in HDR. I like using this one. It's pretty neutral. It gives you some nice reflections. I'm going to turn off the background, and I'll add one more object. We're going to go with a Redshift standard camera. I'll take everything and group those. I'll come back up to my customization and save this as my default scene. I'm going to bring up my render view. And I usually dock this over here on the side. And generally when I use 2 monitors, I have a little bit more real estate to work with, but this gives me a render view that I can see what's happening while I work over here. So we'll go to customization and save that as the default scene, and we'll save the startup layout. And then the next thing I'm going to cover is how to set up some custom key commands. So we'll go to Customization Command Manager. And I like to do my points, objects, polygons, all of those as key commands so that I can cycle through everything really quickly. And I'm going to get an error when I assign my key command because I don't use those key commands for navigation. We'll go into the points mode, and I'm just going to say Shift 1. Edges. All right, so that should get us started. And that's just how I like to set up my scene. I have a lot of custom key commands that I use. And I'll also, at this point, show you how you can load in a custom layout. So if you go up to Window, Customization, and load a layout, I've got one here on the desktop. And so it's really easy to just load this in. Mine's going to look crazy because I usually work on 2 monitors, and I've got a lot of these extra windows that usually are on a second monitor. You can save any layout you want if you made one for a single monitor, or if you had one that you liked from a previous version. It's easy. That's all it takes to load it in. And I can always just go back to my startup layout, and this is what I had set up from before. So then I'm going to move on to my next project. And this is a promo that I made for our Atlanta meetup group, and I'm wearing the t-shirt today. We're going with Ease ATL. That is the name of the group. It was started about 6 years ago by David Dodge, and I am working now with him as an admin. And this was for it was just to promote one of our local meetup groups. So I'm going to open all of these references. And this meetup was at a place called Westside Motor Lounge. They have this very cool, colorful, industrial aesthetic. A lot of yard games. It's a really cool place. And now, having shown these references, I'll play the promo, and hopefully you can see where I got some of the inspiration. And we were actually really lucky that Joran from Pixel Lab agreed to sponsor our group, so we get to give out stock packs at each of our meetups. And what I'm going to cover right now is this final scene with this illuminated sign. And these string lights are just a model that I bought from TurboSquid. They came in all as a single mesh. So I'm going to start just by deleting some of these tags. I'll go into points mode. And I'm going to rectangle select almost all of them. I only need this one section over on the side, so I'll just hold Shift to select the rest of those points. And now I need to make these individual objects because everything is one single mesh. So I'll go to Polygon Islands to Objects. And that's now separated everything into individual objects. I need to center the axis on all of these, so I'll come up to Mesh. And let's see, Tools. Come to Axis and go to Axis Center. And we'll just execute that. All right. We'll just middle mouse select the top, and I'm going to deselect that parent object. So then I'll hit Group, pull that out of that default, and now I can reset my transform. And I have one that I've already selected all of these bulbs. So I'm going to make a copy of the bulbs class, and I want to create a redshift light. I can bring the intensity down and make it a sphere. And now I want to put one of these lights into all of these individual bulbs, and I don't want to do that by hand. So I'll take my bulbs glass copy, and I'm going to say, well, actually, I'm going to make an instance first. Because I'm using the same bulb over and over again, now I can put this into a null, call this instance master. I can hide that from the editor. Now I'll take my bulbs class, middle mouse select, unselect the parent, and I'll say replace with. Click on my instance, hit enter. And now I've got an instance of my light in each of the individual bulbs. I have the filament selected, so I'm just going to use this grayscale gorilla material. This is the neon. I'll put glass onto the bulb's glass, and then I just am using rubber cord for the rest of the plastic and the cord. And then for the, let's see. So I can get started on the sign. I'm just going to create a plane. Make it 5 feet by 3 feet. We can do 60 on the width, 1 on the height, and we'll make it plus Z. And then in points mode, I just want to go through and deselect every third point, which I've already done. So I can just pull these points forward, and that's going to give me a ridge pattern. I'm going to add a bevel deformer. And I want to restrict the bevel deformer because I'm going to make a copy because I want to have the front faces pretty sharp and the back sides a little bit more rounded. So I'll say UI to invert my selection. I'll convert that into a point selection or into an edge selection. And I'm going to store that. So now I will take my bevel deformer. I'm going to put it at 0.1. I'll copy that by holding Control. Make this 1 with about 3 subdivisions. And I'm going to restrict that just to the selection that I made. So I'll just drag my selection into the selection field. And now I've got a really nice sharp front face and much rounder back faces. So I'm going to put this into a symmetry. And if I hold 7, I can drag my symmetry out without moving my child object. And then instead of using a material to mimic the backlighting, I'm going to actually set that up. So I'll come up to Redshift, make a light, and change this to a cylinder. And then I'll rotate it 90 degrees. And then that's going to go into a MoGraph cloner. Set it up as a grid. We'll do 1, 5, 1. And let's put those at like 15 apart. Make sure everything's centered. And then for the material, I'll just grab a Redshift standard material. I'm going to go down to the transmission and up that to about 0.5, and I'll change the color to just something that's kind of yellowish. Assign that to the plane. So now if I hit play, I'm going to get this really nice illumination effect coming through the transmissive material. Start a new scene. And now I'm going to cover how I did the arrow part of that sign. So I'll merge in objects. And now to make the two different parts of the arrow sign, I'll go into my points mode. I'm just going to select one point from the inner part, press UW to select everything that's connected, and then I'll say UP, and that's going to split that off, and I'll have an individual spline that I can put into its own extrude object. And I'll do the same thing with the other spline. And then I'm going to create a couple of grayscale gorilla materials that I'm going to mix using a material blender. I will open So I'll grab my redshift material. Come to my node editor, which is down here at the bottom. I'm going to search for material blender. I'll create a reference. Make two of those, and I'll drag these grayscale gorilla materials in. And the reason I'm blending these is I want to avoid any noticeable tiling. So I'll just drag this first painted material in, go to my other reference and drag that one in. Then I'm going to create a Maxon noise. I'll just solo that node so I can see what I'm doing. I'll hit S to zoom in on what I just copied into the scene. And I apply this material. And I think I'm just going to make them both cubic in this case. Come back to my noise. I'm going to change it from standard noise to FBM. Take the scale down a bit. I'm going to up the contrast a little bit. Take the brightness down a tad. So now I'll go back to my material blender, and this noise is going to be my blend color. The reference is going to be material 1. And my base color is my other reference. So now if I unsolo that noise and plug this material blender into my surface, it's going to avoid having any of the tiling pattern from the peeling texture. And then if I want to change the color, I can do that with a color absolute. I'll do that in the individual materials. And that'll just go into the diffuse color. Make it something kind of red. There we go. So that covers how I did the arrow part of the sign. And then I'll go over into Illustrator. And what I have here is a screenshot of the front of my sign, and I decided to set all my type in Illustrator so that I could have everything kerned the way that I wanted. And I knew everything would fit because I was referencing that 3D geometry. So then I copied that over into Photoshop and just made a black and white texture. And we'll come over to C4D, and I'm going to merge my objects. I'm going to go to Marquee V2. And now I can just delete out all of my lettering. This will go into an extrude. We'll check hierarchical, and we'll go to like 0.3. So I'll copy my Redshift standard material and apply that. Drag in my lettering texture. I'm going to solo that. So I'll just right click on this tag. I'm going to change it from UVW to flat. I'm going to right click on that. I'm going to say fit to object. Come back to my material. I'm going to take my base material and put the transmission weight way, way up. Put it mostly all the way to black. I'm going to make this mostly black. I'm going to go with a material blender. This is going to go into my material 1. The blending color is going to be that texture. And this will be my base layer. I'll unsolo that. And then I'm going to go into my extrude, just disable that for a minute. I'm just going to take that outside spline and turn it off. And now I've got my individual plastic letters. So then I'll just go through the main scene and just step through this. This is really simple. My camera was not moving, so I've just got a couple of cubes standing in as buildings. I have some mega scans of grasses and plants. This aspen tree came straight from the asset browser, so I was able to just pull that in. And then I have a Megascans gravel texture. And the only interesting thing about that texture is in my displacement settings, I usually change the new range minimum and maximum. I go with -1 and 1. And so that keeps all of my dark values depressed instead of just being on the positive side of displacement, because things can tend to get a little bit blobby. And that allows to have both depressed areas and positive displaced areas. All right. And then the next project that I'm going to cover it was a project for Auntie Anne's that I did while I was at Primal Screen. It was very much inspired by the Bud Bowl from the early 90s.
Welcome back to Nug Bowl. We're here at Annie Ann Stadium. It's been Cinnamon Sugar's Sweet Speed versus the Big Dog Defense of the Mini Dogs.
You's talking real sweet and salty, Stu. The team's getting formation. It's go time. Those mini dogs are beefed up.
Ray scrambles right, dogs pursue.
Oh, it's a huge pass.
And it's caught! He breaks the tackle! Touchdown! Cinnamon Sugar scores!
Here we go.
Mini Dogs really need a break here.
What they need is a miracle.
Cinnamon Sugar lining up to kick.
Hot dog, it's blocked.
Mini Dogs recover! Only one Sugar left to beat!
Look at that dog roll.
Touchdown, Mini
The
Dogs!
dog's win.
The underdogs win! What a twist! Get your Annie Ann Snack Stadium delivered free for game day.
And may the best pretzel win.
So that project came out around the same time as the big game, as we were told to call it. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the field. And we wanted to have individual blades of grass to mimic the turf, but we were not going to be able to use hair for the entire scene. It was going to be too heavy, and any kind of texture that we were going to apply to that field, the resolution was not going to hold up if the camera was down really close. So the way that I dealt with that, so I'm just going to go ahead and start with a plane. Make that 3 feet by 3 feet. I'm just going to go ahead and add a hair object. I'm going to change the length down to 2. I'm going to go into the Generate tab. I'm going to tell it not to render hairs. I'm going to go with flat. So now when I zoom in, I've got all of these little triangles. So then I can go into my hair material. I'm going to change the thickness to 0.1. And I'm just going to add a little bit of kink. I can put this into a cloner. Change the spacing to 3 feet. Make it a render instance. And I can add as many copies as I need to cover the surface of the field. Then I can make it editable. I'm going to go ahead and export that as a Redshift proxy. put it at the world origin, selected objects, no lights, and just say okay. And then I have one where I have my proxy imported. And something that took a little bit of digging to figure out was how to apply my material to the whole Redshift proxy. And what I actually have is a camera map node. And I just have an overhead camera set up. And if I hit play, and that just let me put the texture over the whole surface of the Redshift proxy. And now I'm going to talk about the nuggets. I've got a early test. And actually this whole project was animated in Maya. The characters were done in Maya just because that's who we had available at the time. It's not because Cinema 4D can't do it. It's just because Nick uses Maya, and I was able to bring everything in using a Limbic. And that let me do all of the backgrounds and juggle that while we were trying to do everything simultaneously, because we had a 15-second cut down that was due first. So everything was rendered separately and then composited later in After Effects. And this was me testing whether or not I could get the Olympics to import correctly and make sure that we could maintain the motion on the pom-poms, which were done just with spheres and hair added. And I was able to put the hair directly onto the imported Olympic. And we got food photography from a food stylist and a photographer. So I took that food photography and I just took it into Illustrator and outlined the shape of the nugget. And then I started with a cylinder. Make that a lot smaller. Make it editable, and I'm just going to squish it a little bit this way. So I'm going to go into polygon mode, and because all of these are triangles, I'll just select those and delete them. I'll press MD, and that's going to let me fill the hole. Then I can use my knife tool by hitting KL, and I'm just going to cut these into quads. And I did this on both the top and the bottom. And then I went into my brushes. And I use these sculpt brushes all the time, even without sculpt tags. It just lets you really intuitively push and pull things around. And I eventually ended up with something that looks like this. And I've added that to a subdivision surface. And I've applied this material that I made. That was taking all of the different angles of the food photography. And that created a material that looks like this. And this is intended for cylindrical mapping. And then I've taken and projected the top and the bottom and relaxed those edges. And I'm actually using two different UV maps. One of them has the relaxed ends, where I've gone through and just projected and then relaxed these ends. And the other one is just the cylindrical part. And I'm going to blend those two together to get a nice smooth transition between my two UV maps. So I'll make a loop selection. I'm going to fill those in by hitting UF. Set the weight. It's going to be 100%. So if I go back into my material now, I'm going to add in a ramp. And I can take my vertex map that I created, which didn't get saved because we accidentally crashed C4D. So I'm going to create a vertex attribute. I'll drop my vertex map into the attribute name. Put this into the ramp. It's going to be my alt input. And now I can duplicate this texture. Do another material or color layer. This will be the base color. This one will be color 1. And my vertex will be the mask. And so I'm going to tell this particular texture to use my UVW ends. This one's using the UV main. And if I take this color layer, plug that into my color. And if I hit play now, I'm going to have a smooth transition, theoretically a smooth transition between these two textures. But the ramp is just taking this vertex attribute and converting that to a black and white map. Not exactly sure why that's not rendering the way that I expected it. Well, in general, it should be giving us just a nice mask for those two different UVs. And then for the cinnamon sugar nugget, I created that using a redshift matrix. What I have here I had that hidden from the viewport, but that's just referencing some small cubes that I have. I'm going to go into the matrix and tell it to use this cylinder. And that looks kind of wild in the viewport, which is why I had it hidden. But then if I zoom in, you can see my cinnamon sugar, and it's all referencing just this nugget. And I think that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. Again, I'm Kelcey Steele. You can find me on Instagram at SteeleKelcey and at kelceysteele.com. And then definitely check out Ease ATL for our Atlanta meetup group.